All right. We are going to keep things fairly brisk and fairly light this afternoon. After all, my goodness, here we are almost in the middle of July. Happy summer after one heck of a year. To those who don't know me, my name is Peter MacLeod. I'm the principal of MASS LBP. This is our MASS Summer Update, and it's a chance to share a little bit with you about what has been happening here at MASS HQ over the course of what I think we can all acknowledge has been a very long year. I want to take a moment to recognize that I am reaching you today from the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently the Mississauga of the Credit. And we give thanks for their continued stewardship of the land and its peoples. For my Canadian colleagues and perhaps some of my international friends as well, I also want to extend our congratulations to the Governor General designate, who will be Canada's first Indigenous Governor General, the soon-to-be Right Honourable Mary Simon, an Inuk and Northern leader of great acclaim. Over the course of the next 30 minutes, I'd like to share a little bit about what's going on. The game plan is very simple: to talk quickly about the year that was and plant a few seeds for some of the things that we are watching in the year ahead. I've mentioned already that the best way to interact will be through the chat function. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes or so off the top, and then I'm going to try and answer as many of your questions and hear out as many of your comments as you care to make. I'll facilitate that once we get past that halfway mark. So, I do want to start by acknowledging that all of us have been impacted by COVID in various ways. And the hardships for some of us have been, of course, very, very severe. To you and your loved ones, I hope that you are well and that the year ahead will be a much better one in so many ways. The last time we got together to talk about our work, perhaps ominously, was March the 4th, 2020. And I should have been paying closer attention to a friend of mine who, as an associate deputy minister, was sitting conspicuously apart from everyone else in the room, had already begun to social distance, a phrase we hadn't yet learned. And I think none of us could have anticipated then that this would be the last time that we would be gathered in a room, something that is still not entirely possible here in the province of Ontario. When we got together on March the 4th, I tried to share a larger account situating our work at MASS within an increasingly global story, which the OECD, I think, appropriately refers to as the deliberative wave. It's a story of the more than 400 long-form deliberative projects that have been conducted over the course of the past 2 decades in countries around the world. And here at MASS in Canada, we're very proud to play a small part in helping to build that surge and to share what we've been learning over the course of almost 15 years. For those of you who are new to MASS, let me say that working like this over Zoom is not our regular practice. We have been, like everybody, forced into some technological ingenuity, and thank goodness these platforms have existed. Otherwise, it might have been a full stop for us. But at MASS, which is amongst those organizations doing work in the deliberative space, somewhat unique. We're unique in that we are a private company. We are technically MASS LBP Inc., which probably requires me to quickly explain the MASS and the LBP part, because that is not self-evident. To any sociologists on the line, you'll appreciate that we're invoking the idea of a mass public, a phenomenon of the 20th century, an industrialized world where we no longer know necessarily our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues, and so we need interlocutors. We need people building bridges. There's a lovely quote that we've long cited from the Anglo-American pamphleteer Thomas Paine, who said, "There is a mass of sense that lies in a dormant state, that good government should quietly harness. Well, we take that seriously very much as our mission at MASS. But if you're going to have such a high-minded first name concealed in 4 letters, then you need a bit of whimsy. And that's where the LBP comes in. It has confused the lawyers for more than a decade. There's no limited liability partnership here. It stands simply for led by people. But as an incorporated entity with a public mission, we are unique in that we don't accept grant funding. All of our work is fee for service, and all of the deliberate projects we've run have been for public sector, largely, occasionally nonprofit clients who are in a position to act on the recommendations that result from these processes. And that means that what we're doing isn't speculative. It's trying to solve real problems that the public sector and our political leaders are attempting to address. But I don't want to give anyone the idea, it would be a false impression, that we spend all day, every day running citizens' assemblies and reference panels and civic lotteries. In fact, our practice is made up of these 4 different domains: public deliberation, what we call inclusive strategy, civic life projects that are about creating more vibrant participatory culture, and then another category of projects that we call prospects and profile, the stuff we do that leads ultimately to larger opportunities in the first 3 domains. So I'd like to take just a few minutes and share with you a little bit of what we've been up to over the course of the past 12 months in each of these domains, and then maybe talk a little bit about what we're looking forward to in the year to come. So again, you now know what MASS stands for. Here's the run sheet of our organization. Founded in 2007, currently with 8 staff and 2 senior associates. In that time, we've completed about 250 discrete public policy projects, largely for public sector clients across Canada. There have been a little more than 40 what we call long-form deliberative processes. These are AKA the citizens' assemblies and reference panels. I can say more about the nomenclature later. All told, about 1,500 Canadians have had the chance to serve on these assemblies and panels, and cumulatively they have volunteered, I think this is an extraordinary number, 56,000 hours of deliberation on behalf of governments in Canada. And, I'm not going to pretend that it's hit the mainstream yet, but those brown envelopes that we send out inviting people to participate in these processes, we're nearing the 500,000 mark, and about 1 in 38 households in Canada have now received one of those invitations. So where does this all get us to? Well, one of the things that I'm proud to share with you this afternoon, something that I haven't mentioned previously, is that this Friday I'm going to be driving to Queen's University, where the Queen's University Library and the Department of Political Studies has very generously accepted our archives. This is from yesterday afternoon, where we have been, over the last several weeks, bundling up almost 30 linear feet of files from across all of those projects. We're going to be creating what I understand may be amongst the largest single repositories of work on deliberation. Every civic lottery, all of the preliminary materials that go into our processes will be stored in, I was going to call it the MASS collection. I'm told there's a fancier name that I have to use by my academic betters. That is the MASS LBP, Fonds d'Archives on Democratic Innovation and Deliberation. We hope to have that up and operating at the university this autumn. It will be available for all future researchers, and MASS has agreed to continue to make not only its print files, but its digital files permanently on collection at Queen's. So there's a bit of fun. Let's talk about the year that was. Well, I'm so glad that Maria has joined us in this afternoon's webinar. She was my client, and I think we said co-dancers or something. We ended up collaborating very closely over the course of 8 months to produce a strategy that I'm very proud of. In our inclusive strategy practice, we spend a lot of time figuring out how we can bring different elements of an organization and different stakeholders together and really provide clarity and energy and direction for organizations that periodically need to renew their mission and priorities. FSTs was a terrific experience working with one of Toronto's largest social service agencies. Anybody working in social services will appreciate the degree to which these organizations have been tested during COVID, but are also caught up in a much larger trend with respect to how government funds and evaluates these services and the extent to which these services are offered by agencies or the public sector proper. We contended with these and numerous other issues, but over the course of the past year, we've also had the chance to work with Canada's largest nursing union, the Ontario Nurses Association, to develop its first strategic plan. And while we loved working with the 200 or so people at FST, we were working with the 68,000 members of the ONA to produce a document in the midst of what has been, especially for nursing, the nursing profession, an incredibly difficult and challenging year. In Ontario right now, we are slowly beginning to introduce what are called community safety and well-being plans. These are partnerships between local police services, local government, and community services. It articulates a comprehensive direction for a community. We were delighted to be able to work with a phenomenal chief of the Barrie Police Service to develop their first community safety well-being plan. We also got a funny invitation before Christmas of last year. Many of you will have noted and are enthusiastic supporters of this government's commitment to introduce Canada's first disability benefit. If you can believe it, right now, Canada spends on average about $40 billion a year through almost 24 different public sector programs to support Canadians with disabilities. And yet there are more than 1 million Canadians who live with serious disabilities and in poverty. This is why the federal government has committed to introducing this disability benefit. They introduced enabling legislation just before the summer recess. This is a really focused policy exercise to try and understand whether what the government was proposing was in fact possible and what the likely models would be. We'd spend a whole hour talking about this project, working with Al Admansky, Rebecca Pauls, Jennifer Robson, Lindsay Tedds, a fantastic group of people, John Stapleton. We worked out 3 models, which we understand government is using as a kind of springboard for its own work to bring forward a proposed benefit. We've also spent some time working with our friends and colleagues at the Wellesley Institute, who have a partnership with the World Health Organization to bring forward the next big initiative around tobacco control. We've gone through the era, of course, of raising consumption taxes, smoking cessation campaigns. But one of the things that you might find alarming is the extent to which public sector entities still have exposure to tobacco equities. Likely your pension plan, possibly a European health insurance scheme. And billions of dollars are tied up, passively or intentionally invested in tobacco. We're working with Wellesley and WHO to make the case for why, much as we see a divestment movement around climate, water quality, and other important causes, why tobacco should be among them. Let me turn now to civic life. We have had the fortune of working with the Greater Toronto Airports Authority, aka Pearson, for a number of years. When you next have the opportunity, and I hope it's soon, to fly into or out of Pearson Airport, when you fly, the route you take, and some of the procedures the pilot employs will have in part been informed by the work of a randomly selected reference panel of residents living at various distances from the airport who in 2016 helped write the airport's noise management policies. Well, we weren't able to continue with that work in the midst of COVID, and we shifted gears. The airport has long had a strong social purpose team that tries in various ways to give back to the community, cognizant that kids weren't going to be in school, and knowing, as I do, a proud father to a 2-year-old, that kids love airplanes. We decided to create something called the Toronto Pearson Airport Explorers Club, which provides dozens of hours of online programming for kids interested in learning more about aviation. This was something we quickly put together last summer, but we were totally surprised and very much pleased when it won a Global Aviation Award for programming. We've also had the chance more recently to work with Saskatoon's public library system. Now, I'm not sure how many Saskatchewanians we've got on the line here, much less those from Saskatoon. But let me tell you, the library that is being designed by Chevalier Morris and Architecture 49 is going to be an absolute standout landmark in that city. It is critically a library which is being informed deeply by local Indigenous cultures, and the principal architect from Architecture 49 himself Indigenous. This will be a lasting contribution to reconciliation and a really stellar civic asset. And we've had the fun and pleasure of cooking up a bunch of ideas that would get vastly more of the community involved, and not only thinking about the future of that library space and the services it will provide, but getting people involved in the decommissioning, the construction, and the welcoming and ceremonial opening of that library. Earlier on in the pandemic, we worked with some of our health colleagues around something called LTC Plus. This was about partnering long-term care facilities with hospitals that could provide services in the midst of COVID that traditionally hadn't been available. We were delighted to work with Brian Wong, as well as the team at Women's College, to help put this together and get it out in the field. And we continue our longtime work with one of the largest transportation planning bodies in North America, Metrolinx, for which we run a number of reference panels. In fact, we had the conclusion of our standing panel last September, where a 2-year process was virtualized for its final meetings. But I continue to chair the region's CEO, CAO roundtable, an opportunity for people from the municipalities and the planning agency to stay on the same page. Amongst the civic life efforts, though, that we are most excited for this past year was the launch of something we're calling MASS Learning. MASS has long had this sort of ingrained desire, and today certainly is an exception to that, that we try and show, not tell too much about our work. But we were getting some requests. Could we try and explain more about our approach to public engagement? Working with my colleague, Dr. Lori Drake, we cooked up something called Working with the Public, a now 7-session course, which we are running 4 times each year. If you're interested, masslbp.com/learning. You'll note it's not called Public Engagement 101. It's not called Public Consultation 101. It's intentionally called Working with the Public. And it's because at MASS, even though we are a ostensibly public engagement firm, I'm increasingly uncomfortable with the language. I don't like how it allows me to simply talk about having engaged him or consulted with her. Saying that you work with someone rather, implies something I think deeper, and actually obliges me not to simply deploy a program, a framework, a process on someone, but suggest a greater parity in the relationship. Lori and I spent the better part of the year doing a lot of conceptual work to try and distill some of what we take for granted in our practices here. One of the things that I've long wanted to sort of take a run at is revising Arnstein's ladder, or the IEP2 spectrum which runs generally from informing people to empowering them, and instead describing it as a continuum between thinking about the public as a risk to be managed rather than as a resource to be tapped. And any of my MASS colleagues know that that has been a kind of precept of our work from the beginning. But in working with the public, we get to pull this apart and really explore what it means. The extent to which public sector entities often try and control the conversation through strategies you'll recognize. Limiting the amount of time people have to talk about things, limiting the questions that are asked, managing the encounter, mitigating what they think could be the potential for conflict. Or often people just feeling ignored. So we get this host of ambivalent behaviors where they presume to know what people want, they neglect to ask them in the first place, they minimize those concerns, and they proceed without the buy-in of those who may be impacted. And in introducing this paradigm of resource thinking, we think there are some complementary strategies about cultivating, nourishing, identifying, and ultimately replenishing the public through this work that pays a democratic dividend to society as a whole by strengthening the democratic fitness of the individuals and communities who participate. Now, look, I've got at best 10 minutes more, and I know many of you are perhaps most interested in the work that we've been doing around public deliberation. After all, that is why we exist, to try and popularize and embed deliberative processes in Canada's policy-making culture. Well, throughout COVID, we virtualized these processes and managed to deliver 4 reference panels or citizens' assemblies. One major citizens' assembly, which I'm going to discuss in a moment, the Canadian Citizens' Assembly on Democratic Expression. But for Ontario's Financial Services Regulatory Authority, we also randomly selected a group of Ontarians who are prepared to meet with us online for days and days and talk about what I know is a hot button issue for any motorist in this province, and that is auto insurance. People in Ontario will be familiar that we're in the midst of a restructuring of our health system. We have largely disbanded the LHINs, created an agency called Ontario Health, and at the local level created Ontario Health Teams. Back in MASS's earliest days, LHINs had just been created, and we worked with a number of them to establish their health system priorities. Now, more than a decade later, another turn of the wheel in the health system, and we find ourselves working with a very different configuration of health system actors and working again to update and re-articulate what those health system priorities might be. We're delighted by the opportunity to work with some very excellent colleagues in the Sault Ste. Marie Algoma region. And then a chance to work with our longtime friends at West Neighborhood House. One of the most beloved, I think, social service agencies in this city, Toronto. West Neighborhood House comes from a very venerable model of newcomer settlement and continues to play a disproportionate role in helping community members in West Toronto. We convened a number of local residents, in part just to check in about how people were doing, but also anticipating a new strategic plan at West and a potential redevelopment of one of their sites. It was a tough conversation, and one that has gone quite a ways in shaping that organization's priorities for the next 5 years. But let's talk about CADE. If you are interested in not only learning more about the project, we've created a few videos. The report is posted, commissioncanada.ca. Look, we planned this thing and we sent out letters in February of 2020. What did that mean? COVID hadn't hit, but people were expected to respond in the pandemic's earliest days. We shuddered. We thought we were cooked, that nobody was going to volunteer to come in the autumn to Winnipeg and Ottawa just as the depth of the pandemic was starting to make itself felt. I can report to you that even in the midst of a public health crisis, Canadians are more than willing to volunteer and put their names forward. And we had almost 500 Canadians volunteer to participate. The game plan followed a standard citizens assembly or reference panel process. The dialogue was to begin in Ottawa. It was to move to the Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg. And what you're looking at now is roughly a schematic of how we would have allocated the time. The teal is deliberation, white and yellow is presentations. And over the course of the more than 40 hours we'd have had together, we'd have moved from values to talking about issues to discussing priorities and ultimately producing recommendations. This is what we know how to do, and it's what we've done 40 times before. We hadn't yet tried to do it online. And of course, doing a national project online comes with a couple of wrinkles in Canada. Ultimately, we had to surrender any hope of bringing people together and virtualize the process in its entirety. And Sherry has joined the webinar here. She was a member of our team. She lived each and every one of these innocuous looking dots. You'll appreciate, as a bilingual country, we had to run the program in both official languages. All right, you can have simultaneous translation on Zoom. Fine. But what do you do about the 6 time zones? Well, that's what made an 18 session process ultimately stretched to 34 meetings. Those large circles are 3-hour sessions on Saturdays that we held. When you're crossing 6 time zones, people are just waking up in the West as they're ready for dinner in the East, and you can only work with the middle part of the day. So there's a constraint. Each of those small dots, or the medium-sized dots, those were meetings that had to happen 3 times on weeknights. So we would be going live to Western Canada here from the MASS office at 10 p.m. so that we were getting people more reasonably. At 7 p.m. in Vancouver, we were running a dedicated French session. Look, I'm not going to rush to do another one of these, I'll be honest, but we definitely were able to prove that it's possible. And, you know, one of the joys of this was not just the chance to connect with people. We asked them midway through, so how is this going for you? And yes, it was arduous, but they said, you know, in the midst of this pandemic where we're told to be socially isolated, it's really nice to have a way to connect with other people. It contributed to an esprit de corps for our 42 members. And distinctively, the assembly was twinned with a commission, which was made up of 7 distinguished Canadians and experts, including our former Chief Justice, Beverly McLaughlin. And I can assure you, for all of us, it was a special treat to be able to interact with someone like Madam McLaughlin from our bedrooms, like Nathan Ray, or me with the perpetual blue screen behind me. They were generous with their time. Madam McLaughlin was very generous in acknowledging the contributions of the panel, believing that it was really significant in assisting the commission in its own deliberations. Ultimately, 2 reports were issued. The Assembly managed to reach agreement on 33 significant recommendations. These have been communicated to the Minister of Canadian Heritage, and I've been assured that much of that thinking has found its way into some of the forthcoming legislation that the government intends to introduce now on what will likely be the other side of a federal election. So I need to start wrapping up here, but some of you will know that CADE is not a one-off. In fact, it is a 3-year process focused on democratic expression. In our first year, we looked at online harms and how government could mitigate those harms while preserving our rights with respect to free expression. 2 weeks ago, we sent out our next set of brown envelopes. 12,500 left our Interpro plant, went to Canada Post, and we've already had some of our first registrations. This year, we're going to be looking at whether there ought to be specific legal penalties for the intentional spread of disinformation. I think everybody is very cognizant of the challenge being posed to Western democracies, either by internal actors or by foreign actors who are determined to erode trust and confidence in our institutions and weaken the body politic. Other countries, New Zealand, Germany, France, have taken much more significant actions. We'll be looking to those countries, as well as countries that have intentionally not put in place different restrictions, and will be trying to advise the government on what Canadians believe is the right made in Canada path for us. Last thing I want to say, deliberative wave. You know, we are certainly not alone in having had to change the way we've done our business in the midst of COVID. And I want to give a big shout out to my Australian and European and American and Latin American colleagues who've been running processes through Zoom and Google Meet and, well, Microsoft Teams. No, nobody likes that. Terrible platform. But they have kept it going. And thousands of citizens around the world through the height of the pandemic have been able to advise their governments on everything from climate change strategies to parking policies to human rights legislation to land use. And as I've described before, this deliberative wave, which continues to grow, I believe is made up of 3 distinct projects. So if you're new to this and you're looking for a way to make sense of the fact that they're working on auto insurance in Ontario, but climate change in France, think about 3 distinct projects underway and how these processes are being used to solve different kinds of challenges. So where there is a political impasse, we see them being employed by national governments to address constitutional and quasi-constitutional issues. This is what helped to override the prohibition on reproductive choice in Ireland and ultimately legalize gay marriage. What we see in a number of countries is increasingly the bolting on of deliberative processes to parliamentary institutions. I'm going to say more about that in a moment, but it is an important vector of parliamentary or legislative reform to see these kinds of processes attached to committees and attached to legislative bodies. So much of our work at MASS is focused on the regulatory domain, and the reason for that is quite intentional. Our goal is to see that every Canadian, at least once in their lifetime, gets a brown envelope, and that every Canadian knows somebody who's had a chance once in their life to sit on one of these panels. We don't think that solves our democratic ills, but we think it would be a really nice intervention in our democratic culture. The only way we can get to that kind of scale is by looking at all of the workaday issues of government. Questions of regulation that often leave public sector leaders between a rock and a hard place, not knowing what decision to make and needing a source of legitimacy for that decision. So I'm quite bullish on the regulatory domain, but I'm always so excited to see the great work happening in other jurisdictions on the large political projects and the parliamentary reforms that we need. So, starting something new with our seminar webinar, I'm going to point all of you, this is entirely subjective based on my kind of finger in the wind. I want to send a signal about the country I'm going to be watching this year, because I think we see not only one of these waves at play, I think we see all 3 of them. And that country to watch over 2021 and 22, drum roll, fanfare, imagine it in your mind, it's Belgium. Belgium is an absolute leader right now in the use of deliberative processes and civic lotteries or sortition. And it's easy to, of course, point to Belgium and say, wait, isn't that place that didn't have a government for the better part of a year and has very complicated federal structure? I'm no expert in Belgium, but I would suggest that actually it's that highly decentralized, highly federated structure that is actually allowing the green shoots of democratic innovation in the form of these deliberative processes to take hold. So what am I watching? I'm watching the Franco-Brussels Parliament, where they are using reference panels to advise legislatures. I would look to the Belgian Parliament itself, where we have randomly selected citizens sitting next to elected parliamentarians on parliamentary committees. And we see some of the first political parties running explicitly on platforms of shaping their policies through the use of reference panels, and also delegating seats to those who are randomly selected. I'm not going to take a view on whether all of these ideas are good ideas, lasting ideas, the right path for that country. But if you're interested in how our political imagination is being expanded, what we like to call D2, or democracy's second act, D1 being the fact that we got everyone to vote, D2 being the fact that we're going to find better ways to get more people involved in the work of government itself, then Belgium, I think, should be on your radar. If you're interested in following more of what's going on at MASS over the coming year, many of you found your way to today's webinar by following the MASS bulletin. There are a few things to watch for. We're going to be getting a series of quarterly conversations with deliberative leaders in Australia, in Belgium, and other countries besides. We're going to put out a playbill in September that will have the names and dates of individuals. I've already mentioned our course, Working with the Public, starts again September 14th. You can register up until September the 7th. And I'm not going to say anything more during this update, but if you follow the bulletin, we're going to be canvassing for some readers for a very special project that my friend and colleague Richard Johnson and I have started, and that we hope is going to bear fruit later this year. I'm going to turn now to the chat box, and I'm happy to take any questions. I see an immediate one about misinformation and disinformation. Please don't be shy. I'm happy to answer any questions, both about the nature of running a small organization in this space in the midst of a pandemic or in times besides. I'm happy to talk about specific projects. I'm also happy to talk more about some of the concepts behind our work. We've got 20 minutes here, so anything anybody would like to add, throw it in the chat. And I'm going to come off my shared screen now so that I can focus a little more on who's actually in the room with us. I'm going to take that first question from Michael. Misinformation and disinformation, often you see them used interchangeably. Again, not being an expert in the space, disinformation traditionally implies intentional state-sponsored dissemination of information known to be false for the purpose of destabilizing institutions and other entities. Misinformation is erroneous information, often intentionally distributed, but is not part of a state apparatus. I also appreciate a few people putting in some links to the chat function there. Feel free to type, and I suppose actually we've got enough people that it's manageable. If somebody would like to come off mute and ask a question. Jose here writes, I'm curious to hear how you think the pandemic and experiments with virtual consultation will influence and inform the deliberative wave in my work in particular. Great question. So, you know, as I said, I'm not going to hurry to run another 34 meeting process. When we run CADE2, we will be bringing people together in Ottawa in November, but we are going to run a series of preliminary meetings, opportunities for people to hear from some of the speakers. Basically, part of the learning component of the reference panel will be conducted online. We think that's a more efficient use of resources. It allows us to create some evening sessions rather than keeping everybody in a single room. I think that's a positive development. I think we're also going to use it for interstitial moments, even on regional or provincial bodies where we're meeting 4 times over the course of several months. All right, let's check in periodically. So I see this technology, as I think a lot of organizations do, not only in this sector, but as a complementary way of enhancing the core offering. hope that. Oh, I also wanted to point to Taiwan. There are certainly different schools of thought, of organizations and approaches to public engagement. Those focused on deliberation are among them, but also are those focused on at-scale participatory exercises. And if you're interested in this, then you've got to pay attention to what Taiwan is doing, and specifically the work of their digital minister. It's become the case using a platform called vTaiwan that regularly tens of thousands, and in fact hundreds of thousands of Taiwanese are participating in online consultations. And they use sophisticated metrics to kind of gauge people's perspective vis-a-vis others, and to synthesize. We see the use of AI increasingly to digest huge volumes of data and prepare natural language summaries to public officials about what people are thinking. This goes well beyond the kind of public opinion research and surveys that we're used to. I would definitely watch for them. John Stapleton says, will you get back into the topic of changing how we vote from first past the post? Seems like a good idea after the New York mayoralty success. I'm not going to take any view on the success of the New York mayoralty campaign, but for those who are unaware, it was the first time New York City has used a ranked ballot. This is a project, of course, that Dave Meslin, amongst others, have been working to secure in Ontario and across Canada. MASS's connection to the electoral reform movement is somewhat incidental. Personally, I think we would all be better off if we introduced some form of proportionality to our provincial and federal bodies. The reason why we're so closely connected with that is because the first two modern uses of citizens' assemblies, really in the West in the 1990s, occurred in British Columbia, and many of you will recall in Ontario in 2006. I sometimes joke that MASS is the unexpected love child of the Ontario Citizens Assembly. I had the fortune of working with Taylor Gunn and others on a parallel students' assembly, and was initially quite skeptical about the model until I ended up spending quite a few Saturdays with Jonathan Rose and others at the moot court room at Osgoode Hall at York University and observing it firsthand. That's a whole other topic, John. I'm happy to take on some other point. But suffice to say that our focus is really on citizen deliberation while supporting other efforts like electoral reform to strengthen our democracy. Stephen Davies says, do you see the MASS mission and mandate extending into advocating to the various levels of Canadian government on democratic renewal or democratic wave? Great question. I would recommend to all of you an op-ed that Roland Paris and Jennifer Walsh ran in the Globe and Mail last month. The gist of the article was Canada needs to get back into the democracy building business, not only abroad, but at home. I know that that project, especially as a Cold War initiative, deeply problematic on any number of levels. But I think we are all very much aware that Western democracies are being explicitly challenged by authoritarian regimes, and that there is a contest on to secure the confidence of our publics. Walsh and Paris point to a number of strategies that could be employed. This is why I don't think public engagement is a nice to have. I actually think it's a matter increasingly of national security, and it should be able to avail itself of the kinds of budgets that are employed when we are thinking about continuity of government and the preservation and evolution of liberal democratic values. There's a lot going on in this space. I think so importantly in Canada, as we reckon with our past and present as a colonial government, I think there's so much rethinking that needs to happen here. But I'll give you one quick idea that I hope is going to come out in a Canadian magazine this autumn. And it's why Elections Canada, internationally respected amongst the best electoral agencies you might have, I think it should be disbanded. I think we should disband Elections Canada because it is no longer fit to purpose in our times. It's not enough to have a steward of our democratic processes that only spools up into action every 4 years. And that's why with Richard, we're working on a piece that calls for Elections Canada to be replaced by an entity called Democratic Services Canada that would incorporate Elections Canada, but would be involved in efforts not only to support Canadians when they rally to the cause, as they did with Syrian refugees, to support our ability to mobilize around civic challenges. I would note that 50,000 Canadians volunteered for contact tracing, the federal government. They were never mobilized. So democratic services could help us with that. I think there's a real need to invest in civic education, both through our public education systems, but well beyond. I think Democratic Services Canada could assist with that. I'd like to see the public appointments process democratized and the introduction of something we call the second ballot, a service ballot, where in some future time you go to an election, an anonymous ballot, you fill out who you're voting for, and a second ballot, which is not anonymous, you indicate those issues that interest you, as well as those forms of public service that you would be willing to be called up for in the next 4 years. So I think there are a lot of kind of stimulating ideas available to us. I think Canada needs a Democratic Action Fund where we'd spend 5 to 10% of what we spend in a federal election each year on the kinds of initiatives I've mentioned. But until we start making those investments and continue playing around the edges, I don't think we're going to see a significant shift in people's attitudes about the efficacy or responsiveness of our democratic institutions. A few minutes left, and I'm happy to take any final questions. This is a dangerous thing to not have an interlocutor here. Simon asks, how would you like board or the director of Democratic Services Canada to be chosen? Look, I think we have an excellent chief electoral officer. I think there are definitely ways in which we isolate various agencies and functions from partisanship, and I would expect those same mechanisms to be employed by Democratic Services. If anybody would like to jump off mute and ask a question too, you're welcome to do so. Otherwise, I'm going to begin to conclude. I don't want to hold anyone here longer than is strictly necessary. Any comments you would like to make, please feel free to do so. Alexa said, can I speak more about the second ballot idea? And do I have any content on this? Yes, masslbp.com/resources. You will find various publications there, how to run a reference panel, how to run a civic lottery, some videos that go into the thinking behind our work. You'll also find a report called Game Changer, which makes the case for the investment I just described. And you'll also find something called the 9 Ideas. The 9 Ideas include the service ballot, democratic fitness, democratic dividend, social alumni, civic challenges. It's been an unintended byproduct of these past 14 years that we've come up with a lot of nomenclature, terminology to describe what we've been trying to get at. It's a kind of fun fact that civic lottery actually came out of our shop, and it is now increasingly used to refer to what academics call sortition. So yeah, I think sometimes finding new language to describe these ideas helps with their comprehension and transmission. Look, there's a lot there on the website, and just know that myself, any member of my team, we're so grateful that you would gather, that you would take an interest in our work. This is something we're going to try and do annually. Admittedly, we haven't always been the best at keeping the bulletin up to date or our Twitter feed current. As we come back after the Labor Day weekend in September, we're going to make a concerted push to try and reach out a little more often. If there are things that you're interested in, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I can be found at Peter MacLeod or peter@masslbp.com. I'm going to linger for another few minutes. Feel free to Leave a comment in the chat about your experience this afternoon. I hope it has been helpful. I hope a few of you will join us for the course in September. But most importantly, I hope that you, friends, loved ones, and organizations stay well and healthy as hopefully we begin to reach the end of this pandemic and can look forward to being in rooms together again and having some great conversations. Thanks very much, everyone. Really appreciate your time and attention this afternoon.